We're on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Coffee with the Codex, Medical Manuscripts, and Marginalia. I am Jacqueline Sunberg, and if you want to everybody's hearing me already, all right? Yeah? You can give me a message in the chat if you're having trouble. You can send messages addressed to me. I'm Jacqueline Sunberg. Remember to introduce yourself. I'm the outreach librarian here for the Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill, and it's my pleasure to be joining this session of the regular running series of Coffee with Codex. So thank you, Dot, for letting us join onto the regular series. We're going to have a slightly longer session than the normal Coffee with the Codex series. I'm just going to check. A moment. Everything's good. Okay. So before we get started, I have referred to Dot, but yes, Dot Porter is here. Happy to be partnering on this session with her. And I'm going to let one of my colleagues introduce the speaker on our end in a little bit. But for now, before we get started, I wanted to do an acknowledgement of where we're joining you from. You may think that this background is quite extraordinary, and it is. We're in the Osler Library on the McGill University campus. And McGill stands on lands that have long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous nations, many Indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And we recognize them and their peoples as the traditional stewards of the lands on which we meet today. This event we're joining from the Osler Room because one of the manuscripts that we'll be looking at is from that collection. We do welcome chat throughout the event. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them periodically throughout, and we will voice those on your behalf. Because it's a larger group, we're going to leave the participation as chat only and keep microphones in video off. We are recording, but only our presenter videos. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I will step aside and let my colleague Mary Yearl, the head librarian of the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, take over. Mary.
Thanks, Jacqueline. As Jacqueline said, I have the privilege and pleasure of being the head librarian here at the Osler. When William Osler was curating this library that the nucleus of the library as it now stands in earnest from about 1905 to 1919, his goal really was to gather a collection that would aid one's formation as a good doctor. He expected that the library would continue to grow and to reflect changes in both medicine and scholarship, even after his death. So among the factors that we consider when we make new acquisitions today are how a work will serve the scholarly community, but also how we can use it here in teaching. And the manuscript that Professor Wallis will be discussing today is one we acquired with funds donated for its purchase, made in memory of Dr. Joseph G. Stratford, who, among other distinctions, was once a professor of neurology here at McGill, and whose archival fond we preserve here in the Osler. As you'll hear from Professor Wallis, who was Osler librarian for several years before shifting to academic teaching, and is now Professor Emerita of History and Classical Studies, as well as Social Studies of Medicine here at McGill. This manuscript provides many opportunities for scholarly study, but also for the work we do with visitors here and how to highlighting how knowledge was transmitted, how knowledge changed over time, and how scholars have interacted with information over the centuries. Professor Faith Wallis, over to you.
You get the pan shot, everyone.
Okay, I'm in focus. Hello, everyone. If you've got your copy, I've got my Codex, and we can begin. So you go into the clinic for your annual medical checkup, and as you're walking through the door, you see a familiar face and you say, "Good morning, Dr. Brown." Well, you just addressed Dr. Brown by a title which has nothing at all to do with medicine. The word doctor is the Latin word for teacher. Well, imagine that later on that afternoon, Dr. Brown is filling out a form online, and there's a space where she has to enter her profession or occupation, and she types in the word physician. Well, Dr. Brown may not be aware of that, but the word physician has nothing at all to do with medicine. It comes from the Greek word meaning a scientist. Now, in Western Europe in the 12th century, medical professions began to be identified by the titles doctor, that is teacher, and physician, that is scientist. Before that, they were just called medici or medics. And this change took place because medicine began to be taught formally in schools of higher learning. And the best practitioners, at least in their view, were those who were taught that way by doctores, by teachers of medicine. And the medicine that they were taught was a new kind of medicine grounded in ancient science, the theory-based medical science of Galen, reinforced by the natural sciences of Aristotle, and all packaged up by Islamic scholars. The Greek word for natural science is physica. So these new style medical doctors like to style themselves physicians, physici, scientists. This manuscript, modest as it may seem, is actually a monument to that change in medical education and medical science. And we're very happy to have it and to honor Dr. Joseph Stratford, who's a former professor of surgery here at McGill. So he was both an eminent doctor and a physicus. The manuscript has a somewhat unusual history. Up until the 1930s, it belonged to the library of the Benedictine monastery of Admont in Austria, and you can still on the spine see their shelf number for it, manuscript number 496. In the 1930s, Admont was undergoing some financial difficulties, and it was obliged to sell some of its medieval manuscripts, including this one. The manuscript was divided into two parts. You can see in the back where the back part was detached from the manuscript. And the back part still survives. It's in the library of the Istituto Ortopedico Rizzoli in Bologna in Italy. This half remained inside its original medieval binding, and after sort of disappearing from view for a while, it eventually came up for sale to our great good fortune. It's now, by the way, been fully digitized, and we'll put the URL for the digitized version up on the chat so you can look at it at your leisure. The contents of this manuscript are inscribed in the front of the binding, Versus Egidii de Urina, which means the poem on urine by Gilles. The author was Egidius, or Gilles de Corbeil, who died around 1224, and who was the first person known to have taught medicine at the University of Paris. He started around 1200. Universities, which are like organized schools catering to larger and ever-renewing bodies of students, were just emerging at the time. Paris, which is where Gilles taught, was famous for philosophy. So Gilles kind of slipped medicine into the University of Paris by claiming that it was really philosophy. It was the branch of philosophy called natural philosophy, or physica. Medicine, in short, was science, so it deserved to be in the university. Gilles had actually studied at Salerno in Italy, which is a preeminent center of medical learning in the 12th century, and the locus of many of the first translations from Islamic and Greek medical writings into Latin. But he went back to Paris around 1170, and by his own account, he initiated the academic study of medicine there. He composed 4 works for his students, one of which is De Urinis. And when the Faculty of Medicine was actually formally established in Paris in 1270, De Urinis, on urines, was on its official reading list. So it was a standard textbook. This sealed its destiny as a pillar of medical education in medieval and Renaissance Europe. And it survives today, Gilles' book survives today in over 300 manuscript copies. So what's so important about urine? Well, urine inspection was a core diagnostic tool in this new scientific medicine. But the perennial popularity of Gilles' book on urines owes a lot to its innovative form. Gilles wrote a poem. And being in poetry, his On Urines was easy for students to learn and remember, but he also composed a prose commentary to accompany the poem. And this prose commentary unpacked every line and explained its scientific rationale, elaborated on the clinical applications, and so on. So you could say that the poem was the professor's PowerPoint slide, and the commentary was his lecture. And this combination of student-friendly presentation and rich scientific content was what ensured Gilles' on Urines its success. Now, our copy of Gilles' text is not accompanied by Gilles' commentary. As you can see from the explicit here, let's see if I can make the explicit a little bit bigger. Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, okay. It says, here ends the urines of Giles with the comment of Gilbert. The commentary in our manuscript is by Gilbert the Englishman. Now, those of you who studied the Canterbury Tales in college, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, may recall that one of the Canterbury Pilgrims was, wait for it, a doctor of physic. And the doctor of physic was very happy to show off his knowledge of all of the great writers on medical science, one of whom was Gilbertin, in other words, Gilbert the Englishman. So when this manuscript was written at the beginning of the 13th century, Gilbert's commentary, which was much more up to date than Giles, sort of replaced it. Gilbert's commentary took advantage of an awful lot of the newly translated Arabic works of medicine. Let me just pop out here for a second. Point. Come on now. There we go. Good. So what we have here is a book that's made for university teaching. And everything about this book kind of bespeaks the methods of instruction and learning that were practiced in 13th century institutes of higher learning. It's a sort of material embodiment of what scholasticism means. The topography of the page, its layout, is geared to this kind of teaching, and it's swarming with readers' annotations in the margins, even between the lines. And this is what brings the teaching alive and what makes for the particular interest of this manuscript. Scholasticism is the style of teaching cultivated in the schools, in the scholae that appeared in Europe at this time. It's teaching as we understand it. It's collective teaching in a classroom. It's directed by a professor, and it follows a program, a curriculum. Now, in the Middle Ages, the curriculum involved reading an authoritative text. So it was geared to the lecture, but the lecture was the lecture of the authoritative text, which was expounded by the professor section by section. Learning involved the student engaging with the text analytically, unpacking what it said, digesting its contents, but also using the text as a springboard to explore related themes, to raise questions and problems, and we'll see one of these later on. So here's Gilbert's prologue on the first page. There's a paste down here and also on the back cover, which incidentally also seems to come from some medical manuscripts, although I haven't had a chance to try to identify what they are. So what screams scholasticism about this? Well, first of all, it's in 2 columns. 2-column presentation was pretty much de rigueur for scholastic books. 2 columns makes for more rapid reading and more rapid reference, and reference is enabled by these red paragraph marks here. You can really tell where paragraphs begin and end. But incidentally, even for a manuscript that's, I think, a fairly modest manuscript like this one, there's quite generous margins that have been left. It was expected that the margins would be filled with students' annotations and students' comments, or readers' annotations and comments. If we go over to the next page, you can see the layout of the text. The text here that's in a large module is the text of Gilles' poem. So here's, as it were, the PowerPoint slide. What follows in a smaller module of writing is Gilbert's commentary. And all around, there's this, like a swarm of bees, there are these marginal notes, there's notes in between the lines, all of which have been put there by the student readers. Now, Eric Fackel, a historian of medieval manuscripts, whimsically refers to the margins as the empty part of the page, mostly because they're rarely empty. The margins are, in his words, an editorial space for students and readers of the manuscript. The text could be seen as the scaffolding for all of this marginalia. The marginalia can also be seen as scaffolding for the text, or a frame for the text. And in the end, we begin to wonder where and what the text is, because it's really in the margins where scholasticism comes alive. Now, before I plunge into some of the details of the presentation of this manuscript, I just want to say a few words about the subject matter. Inspecting a patient's urine was one of the 2 principal methods of diagnosis, the other being feeling the pulse. Urine was considered to be a waste product of digestion, but digestion was not simply processing food. digestion was the first stage in the liver's production of blood. And this led to the production of the three other humors, phlegm, red bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. And urine bears the imprint of this process. So the state of the urine is a snapshot of the state of the humors and consequently of the whole body. The texture of the urine, whether it's thick or thin, its color, and its contents, the particles in suspension, could all be decoded like a modern lab test. Gilles's poem condenses the interpretive rules into memorable bites. The commentary on Gilbert expounds their meaning. So any questions so far? Yes and no. You'll notice that, well, let's see if I can get this down here. Come on, in. Yes, you'll notice that in Gilbert's gloss here, some of the words are underlined. These are the lemata from the poem. These are the exact words he's commenting on. So when he is in fact unpacking the language, unpacking the text itself, that's a gloss. But then he goes into, I would say, a more commentary format where he's expatiating on the meaning of this particular verse. It's interesting that the colophon in the back also refers to it as a commentary. The language gloss commentary wasn't very stable at this time. A gloss could be a commentary. Commentaries could be called glosses as well.
How many different hands?
Geez, I counted at least 6 marginal hands. Some of them very small and faint. Some of them have little quirks. There's a hand over here that likes to preface his remarks with what looks like a little three-leafed clover on a stick in front of it. I call him Mr. Trefoil. So there's at least 6. It's been through, I would say, several generations of students. And given that this was a standard textbook for so long, hardly surprising.
What do we learn about the reading techniques of the period from this?
Well, stay tuned. Stay tuned, because I'm going to do a deep dive into one of the pages of the manuscript, and we'll see how the readers are engaging with the words of the manuscript. So if we can put that on hold. Any others? Okay, all right. Well, let's just have a look at how the readers are responding to the text. Medieval students didn't have neon yellow highlighter pens, thank goodness, but they highlighted nonetheless. Students learning this material marked up their copies to help them locate and mentally organize the content. If I could go over here to page 14 or folio 14, notice all these NO signs in the margin, NO with a wiggle over the top, NO. This is the word nota, take note. Observe this. This is important. It's like somebody had highlighted it. On folio 9, recto, there's another one down here. Okay, another one up here, particularly brilliant one. So there's other ways in which a student or a reader could say this is important. This is an important passage, and that is by putting a little manicula in the margin, a little fist, like this. Saying, note this is really important. So this is what I would call the markup or highlighting information for navigation. Some highlighting was provided by the scribe himself. Up here, for example, the scribe is listed in red in the margin because it's actually discussed in the text here. The 3 critical signs of fever, which are chills, shivering, and stiffness. Okay, frigus, horripilatio, rigore. So the three key signs of fever. And below, a reader has very helpfully inserted the subject of each section of Gilles's poem. In this case, it's de caropos. Caropos is a color. It's one of the colors of urine. There's 21 colors of urine, but this is one of the colors. It means camel hair gold, I guess. Okay, so Karopos is camel hair gold color. Now, besides using the margins for highlighting, they also used the margins, and here I'm going to really try to zoom in a little carefully. Come on. There. Oh, good. All right. So what you're seeing here is what you call a medieval schematic or a mind map. It's a tree diagram. And in this case, it kind of sums up the whole science of urines in this kind of branching diagram. It says that the physician should observe in urine quantity, the quantity of the urine, or its quality. And the quality can be broken down, branched off into three actually factors. Its color, and here's all the different colors of urine. Its odor, for instance, if it has a heavy odor, it means the members of the body are ailing. And if it has a fetid odor, so that it's sub-branched here, fetid, heavy and fetid, it means that the humors are problematic. Or its substance. Is it thin? Is it thick? Is it just right? Is it in between? Okay. Now, these branching diagrams are classic scholastic mind mapping. There's a whole new book that has recently appeared on the subject, which I recommend. Just a sec, I'm going to pop this out to full size. Yes, Lines of Thought, Branching Diagrams in the Medieval Mind by Ayelet Evan Ezra, University of Chicago Press, which incidentally has a whole chapter in there on medical manuscripts. But it's absolutely classic. Not only does the book begin with a branching diagram, it ends with one too at the very end here. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit here, where all of the 21 colors of urine are listed in column 1. In column 2, there's different indications of health and illness, and lines are drawn between different colors and health and illness. And in the third column here, there's clues to what these colors actually mean. And for example, under Karopos, it says Velis cameli. It's like the hair of a camel. These diagrams are all over the manuscript. And they show that it's coming out of an academic setting. Okay, well, let's take a typical page and see what we can find here. The page I'm going to be looking at is folio 6 recto, and I'm going to try to zoom in. Yes, I think I've got it here. All right. In line 4 of here, you see the word melancholy. It's part of a sentence which says essentially that phlegm is cold, but it's not as cold as black bile. And a reader has put a little point with a slash on top, which leads you out to the margin here. It's sort of like a footnote. This footnote expansion says that there's a reason why phlegm is not as cold as melancholy, and that is that heat departs from melancholy faster than it does from phlegm. So you can see the influence here of the teacher expounding the text. It's adding an explanation in the form of a footnote. On the same line, there is the word glaucous. Let me see. Yes, glaucous here, which means grayish. Okay, and over it, the annotator has written the word color because he wants to make it clear that glaucous is a color of the urine. Many of the technical colors for the urine were not ones that were normally used in everyday parlance. Below here in the line that begins in augmentu, you can see just faintly over here that somebody has introduced a word above the line. There's a word missing here, and it's an important one. So in reading the text, they were also very conscious of the fact that any handwritten text is going to contain errors and omissions. That's just the way manuscripts work. So he has put the word cum, meaning here when, above the line, and it changes the meaning completely. Without that word, the text reads, in a situation where a disease is increasing or has come to a standstill, the morbid matter is dispersed and heats up. Whereas if you put that little word cum in there, the meaning is quite different. In a situation where the disease is increasing or has come to a standstill, when the morbid matter has dispersed, ... Okay, so it's a critical reading of the text that is sort of mediated through a professor's lectures and is designed, in fact, to produce the correct and authoritative reading. If we go over to folio 16 here, you can see in the outer margin, let me find it in the outer margin. Yeah, can we? Oh, good. Okay, right here. All right. There is the word retenta. And on that same line, there's the word recepta with 2 dots over it. In fact, the reader here is correcting the text, not correcting an omission, but correcting a misreading by the part of the scribe. The sentence says that egg yolk yellow urine is urine in which red bile is retained. Okay, whereas the original reading in the margin was in which red bile is received, which makes no sense. So the part of the initial process of learning the text is in fact to correct it. And I think that addresses to some degree Meenakshi's question, although there's much more that can be said here. The importance of authority, the importance of medical authority to these doctors studying in the university is quite significant. And on folio 7 recto, we see an interesting instance of this. If I can find it here, point it out to you. Yeah, all right. Now, let me see if I can make this even bigger. Yeah, I might not be able, it might lose. Okay, so where is our little, yeah, okay, can you see that? It's an A with an R following it. But somebody, yeah, somebody has written on top. Actually, I'll do this, which may help. I've made a little picture of it, and I'm sorry that this is a bit blurry, but AR, let me, come on, pop. Okay, yes. AR usually means Aristotle. And the words before it says, as Aristotle says, people who are going crazy start to talk nonsense. Well, in fact, Aristotle didn't say that. And a reader has put over the AR of the abbreviation for Aristotle, the word Ricardus. Okay, it was Richard who said that. Well, why did Richard become Aristotle? Well, as you can see, if the original abbreviation was an R, by looping out that flourish at the top, you could easily make it look like an A with an R afterwards. This is the absolutely standard abbreviation for Aristotle. So at some point, a mistake fell into the text transmission. But who's Ricardus? It's possibly a prolific medical writer known as Richard the Ancient, Richard the Salernitan, sometimes Richard the Englishman, who wrote, amongst other things, a treatise on urines. And it's understandable that a scribe at some point or other would have mistaken the R of Richard for the AR of Aristotle, not only because it looks the same, but because Aristotle is a very well-known figure. Richard, not so much. So this is an illustration of the principle that if there's a tendency of scribes to banalize what they see, to turn it, if they're stuck with something that they're not quite sure of, they'll turn it into something they know. And in this case, they preferred Aristotle's as a well-known quantity to Richard the Ancient or Richard of Salerno, the 12th century writer. Okay, any questions about this? Because my time is getting. Okay, go.
when did this two-column layout become more standard for scholastic texts?
By the beginning of the 12th, now the two-column layout had been used throughout the Middle Ages. It was used in Bibles, even in the early Middle Ages. It's just that for the most part, texts of secular works were written out in long lines, sometimes with generous margins so that you could put annotations in, but usually in long lines in the Carolingian period, the 9th, 10th century. Books like this for schoolroom teaching, it depends to some degree on the size of the book. If it's really, really tiny, they'll often be just in single long lines. But for a book of this dimensions, it's just about ubiquitous by 1200 that a book like this will be in double columns. It not only makes for speedier reading, also gives you some space down the middle to make further annotations.
One other question
Yeah.
about the style of handwriting.
Yes.
The comment is specifically, it's hard enough to translate all the Latin. Is this style of handwriting and as we used to be here, is this typical for the time?
Yes.
Including that annotation of Aristotle or Ricardo?
Yes. Yeah. Those of you who are familiar with medieval manuscripts know that medieval handwriting is highly abbreviated, and the names of important authorities are often just in the form of initials, like AR for Aristotle, okay, G for Galen, things like that. So now the handwriting itself is absolutely typical for the time. I would put this as a French manuscript, possibly Paris. I wouldn't be surprised if it came from Paris. So it's a very sort of common, straightforward kind of textualis hand, typical of the period when this was made, which is probably the end of the 13th century. Any others?
Yes, one more. How would this scribe, whoever was writing this out, have interacted with the author?
Okay, so
or the physician who created it?
Okay, so the scribe is, of course, copying from an exemplar. The scribe who wrote the main text here in these two columns has another copy of Gilles with Gilbert's commentary beside him. Maybe he has two books. He has Gilles' poem and Gilbert's commentary in two books, and he's copying onto this one. This is why mistakes occur, why omissions creep in, why retenta is read as recepta. And also probably at some point along this transmission from exemplar to exemplar to exemplar to exemplar, the name of Ricardus morphed into the abbreviation for Aristotle, because Aristotle is a much more sort of recognizable authority than Ricardus was. So the original scribe is interacting with the text that is the exemplar. The reader writers who are doing the editorial stuff around the margins are interacting with the text that was produced by the scribe. I would think that this scribe here it could be a student. It could be a student who's making money on the side by writing out manuscripts. It's not particularly fine parchment, as you can see. It's kind of messy, and there's a tear here that was repaired. It's not a handsome book by any means. So it could have been produced by a student or scholar making money. It could be produced by a stationer, a professional. Yes. Yeah.
Because we
do have another codex to look at. Okay.
Yes. So I will just say, I'll pop over this way for a moment and say an enormous thank you for a guide through this one. I'm going to stop sharing our manuscript, and we'll give a chance to Dot to put up her first.
Hello. And I'll turn my video on so you can see me, and if you can, let's see, can you spotlight
Yes, I
my,
can, just a moment.
yeah, spotlight my phone,
Yeah.
and we can all see it. So I'm still, there we go.
Sorry.
Oh, I need to, no, just spotlight my phone.
Yeah. So I've spotlighted the phone, and I'll pin your video as well.
Oh,
So that'll do. So I've got the big screen from your phone.
okay. All right. So I had to pin it myself. So if, I hope everyone who is looking from online can see this one big. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jacqueline. So my name is Dot Porter, and I'm a curator at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies and the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts in the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. My surroundings are not nearly as nice as my colleagues at McGill. I'm in a lab that I use when I do a lot of my work, including Coffee with the Codex. So Coffee with the Codex, I think some of you who are here come often, and welcome to you. And those of you who are here from the McGill end of things, welcome. I'm glad to have you. So Coffee with the Codex is a weekly program that I do on Zoom every Thursday Eastern time at noon. Usually it's just 30 minutes and it's quite informal. This is a little bit special. So I'm really excited to have our friends from McGill, and that manuscript is so great, and it goes so well with the one that I'm going to be showing you. So I'm really excited. So this manuscript, the shelf mark is LJS 24. LJS means that it's from the Larry J. or the Lawrence J. Schoenberg collection. So it was collected by Lawrence Schoenberg, who collected manuscripts sort of in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And his manuscripts are now in the University of Pennsylvania libraries. This particular one is on deposit, which means that we don't own it, but we hold it as part of the collection. LJS 24 is a 13th century medical manuscript that we believe was written in Paris, sort of mid 13th century. It's been dated between 1225 and 1275. So it will look in a lot of ways very similar to the manuscript that we just looked at. I see that there was a question about the binding. The binding is later. I'm looking at the, let me share this with you. I have links, which includes a link to our record, our manuscript record, which is sort of what I'm going from. And there's also a link to the Coffee with the Codex schedule. And if you would like to join our mailing list, there's a link there. But a lot of what I'm going to be drawing on is from a really excellent article by Angela Montford. The article is called Brothers Who Have Studied Medicine, Dominican Friars in 13th Century Paris. This was published in Social History of Medicine, volume 24, number 3. And she took a very close look at this manuscript in particular. And so I'm also drawing on her knowledge, really helpful. I am not a medical historian. I am a curator of manuscripts. And so I'm not going to be able to talk in great detail about the content the way that our previous speaker did. But what I can do is show some pretty pictures, because this manuscript is a little bit fancier than the one that we were looking at before. You can see immediately there's a little bit of color. There are blue and red initials with penwork. It's very nice. And there are a number of illuminated initials as well. These initials are very interesting because they actually show doctors doing their work. And so what I want to focus on really is going through and making sure that we look at every one of these, because they're quite interesting. So Martha has pointed out The image is a little bit blurry. It's because of Zoom. I usually use a different camera app, but I wasn't able to get it to work. So I apologize if it's a little bit blurry. But hopefully we can see here. Now this is the first page, the opening Medica here. And what we have is a Dominican friar who is teaching other Dominican friars. So immediately we are in the context of education. This is an educational text. Most of the texts that are included here are by Isaac Israeli, this was like the text that was used to teach medicine in Paris, the University of Paris, and at other universities where people were learning about medicine. And the Dominicans were, I think, sort of central to that work. And this manuscript in particular, we believe it was made for Dominicans, by Dominicans. All of the doctors that are shown in here are Dominican friars. We know that because of how they're dressed. And so we can see he's wearing a black robe and he's tonsured, and the folks in his audience are also black robe and tonsured. Because this was on the first page, it's a little bit more worn than some of the other ones that we'll see. This is quite informal. If you have questions as I'm going through, don't hesitate to put them in. And I will also leave time at the end for additional questions, because I know there were a lot of questions too coming out of the first one. So the first text is a few pages of the Isagoge. This is actually by a 9th century Arabic scholar who they called Johannitius, which was not his name because it would have been Arabic. So I'm going to pull out, and this is just a few pages before we get to our next one. You'll see again more and more of these blue and red letters. You'll see, like the previous manuscript, this one is not on very nice parchment. The parchment is quite thick, and if you can hear it, it's a little crunchy. I call it crunchy because it sounds like you're crunching when you turn the pages. There's a lot of edges here. So what we're seeing here is the edge of the animal that wasn't, if it was very nice, it would be trimmed and it would be a straight edge. But as it is, we kept these in, even though there's this little bit of gold here. So we're opening with two texts about the pulse. And here we have a friar doctor who's taking a pulse. So you can see he's holding, he looks like a doctor today taking a pulse, right? He's holding the patient's arm, and he has one hand held up and the other one is around the wrist. And you can imagine that he's counting the pulse to make sure that this patient, and this is maybe quite a sick patient because he's in bed, he's not wearing a shirt, he's lying under a blanket. So immediately we have the doctor at work. All right. And then this is quite a short one. And then the next text that we have is actually another text about the pulse, although the illustration is a little bit interesting. So this is an initial cue, and we have, again, a Dominican friar. He's wearing black and he's got his tonsure, and he's standing behind a table where there are sort of 4 little circles on the table. And our record used to say that this was food. You think, well, food and pulse, I don't know about that. But what in her article that I mentioned before, Angela Montford, suggests that in fact, these are 4 things. And the first word in this is quatuor, which means 4. And it's actually talking about the 4 most important parts of the body relating to health. So this is what the text is sort of opening with. And those 4 parts of the body are the brain, the liver, the heart, and the testicles. And she suggests that in fact, this is what, even though they don't really, there's just 4 little kind of circles, maybe that's what that represents. So because otherwise it doesn't seem to have very much to do with the pulse. So it's actually illustrating the text in a way. So we'll skip ahead a little bit. You can see in some places we have larger text. This is probably a commentary. You often see this where you have the main text and the larger text and then the commentary and smaller writing. So moving forward, and I haven't pointed it out, but we will at points see writing in the margins later, especially later hands, which indicated that this was in fact a book that was used. So here on the left, we have an armorial stamp from the Dysart family, which owned the manuscript in the 18th century. So this is much later. Mathilde suggests that it could be the humors. It could be the humors, but since those, I don't know. I don't know enough to know if the humors were ever illustrated in that way, but that could be something else to look into. So the next section is on the diet. And in fact, a large portion of this manuscript it's two big sections of text about the diet. This is the Diet Universalis. So it's basically, here's how you eat to be healthy in a very general way. And the illustration, not surprisingly, is 3 men at a feast. Now, these are not Dominican doctors. These men are wearing blue, and the one in the middle is wearing pink. And we'll see other people dressed like this. And this is just to indicate that they are not Dominicans. And they're eating a wide variety of food. And one of the things that Angela Montfort suggests is that they actually represent taste, smell, and sight, that they are not only people, but they're representative of these senses that have to do with eating. So maybe so. All right, a couple of people are asking about why we're not wearing gloves. And the answer is that there's no reason to wear gloves. And sometimes it's actually not good for the manuscript. So we always want to have clean, dry hands and no gloves. So here are some examples of these marginal notes that I mentioned. These are later hands. So this was a book that was used for quite a while after it was made. And you can see this section goes on and on. This is the diet section. So this was clearly a section that people were interested in reading. I'm going to pause here. We'll see this in a few places. So I mentioned that I'm a manuscript curator. I'm really interested in materiality. So here it looks like a scar a little bit because it is a scar. This is a place where the animal that the parchment was made from had a hole in its skin when the parchment was being made. And so the parchment maker sewed it up. So you can see the little holes. The little holes are where thread went through. And so when it was stretched, the way parchment is made is they take the skin and they stretch it out. And so it was sewn up. So there's not a big hole there. Sometimes you do see big holes in parchment, but not here because there's this careful sewing. And there's several of these in this manuscript. Here is the start of a different text. This is another diet text. It's therapeutic diet. So this is where it's not just sort of general health. This is, we want to be really careful about what we eat. And we have these pretty initials here. The next section, actually no, that we're still in the therapeutic diet section. We have a Dominican friar supervising the feeding of a patient. And so again, we recognize him because of his black cloak out over the white and the pink and the blue dressed like that. So I'm aware we're running a little bit low on time. So I'm just going to skip right ahead to the illustrations. Here's just a little bit of decoration. This is again in the middle of the therapeutic diet. But this is just kind of pretty. We have a little bird and we have a dragon, a little bit of gold. Also, you may have noticed this manuscript has these interesting, so these are manicules too. Manicules are usually little hands, which is why we call them manicules. But this one, for some reason, it's like a little head with almost a tongue poking out of it. If I see, there's lots of them. If I see more, I'll point them out because they're very odd little things. I'm not sure I've ever seen anything quite like it in other manuscripts. So here is, okay. So we have the end of the therapeutic diet, and I know it's ended because it says right here, explicit, dietae particularis, and we have another couple of these little tongue manicules over here. And then the new text starts, but it doesn't look like the start of a text. Usually in a manuscript, you expect to see some kind of initial or something. This just starts in the middle of a sentence, which tells us that there's something missing here. And indeed, the beginning and the end of this text, which is Liber Urinarum, which is the urine, we've already talked about that, is here. So some of that is missing, unfortunately. But that's not all. There's more urine coming up, though. All right, so here we have a book of fevers. And again, we have a Dominican friar teaching. This is a little bit messy, but if you look carefully, you can see he's actually not teaching other Dominicans. In this case, he's teaching people who are dressed in pink, which means that these are lay people that he's teaching, which is sort of interesting. So this is the section on fever, and it has a few initials. Here we have a doctor reading. So we've seen the teaching, and now we have the reading. Jacqueline asks why it is smudged. That's a really good question. It looks like it's been purposefully done, but I don't know why someone would want to do that. But yeah, so I think somebody purposefully, maybe they didn't like that they were teaching non-Dominicans, but that's a total guess. I really don't know. All right, here we have, now this one doesn't even include the doctor. This has one layman wearing blue, covering up the other one with a cloak. So remember, we're in the section on fevers. So this is illustrating, things that you do when you're treating someone with a fever. So this is one of my favorite ones. I actually have this as my little Twitter icon. It's a Dominican doctor who seems to be scolding. That's my modern interpretation. He's got his finger up like he's sort of scolding the layman. I don't know actually what he's doing, but I think that's it sort of shows the dynamic between the two of these. So that's pretty neat. I do think it's interesting that there is this sort of disconnect between, because this does have quite a lot of gold in these initials, and yet the parchment itself isn't great. And usually Faith says teaching. Okay, so that's probably what that is. And then here is the lay doctor or the lay person who's helping the doctor bringing a poultice to the patient. So he's carrying probably some medicine in that's wrapped up in a bandage of some sort. There's just two more, and then we can get back to questions. So here we go. This is 121 verso, and I believe we're still in the section on fever. But what this doctor is doing is examining a bottle, and this is a uroscopy bottle. So this is a urinalysis that's happening here. He's looking at the color, as we heard earlier, and that's what he's doing there. And this is a pretty common illustration. I've seen a lot of these with the holding the vial. And the last one here is another, there we go, of the Dominican, and he's just reading by himself. So this is how we finish up with the doctor reading by himself. So there's educating people, there's learning how to be a doctor, and then there's continuing to read on your own there. And we have about five minutes, I think, for more questions, if there are questions. Jacqueline, do you want to take the lead on Q&A, or do you want me to just answer questions?
Share that. I put one in there for both of you. Having seen these two manuscripts, the one you showed, Dot, is very richly illuminated, or well, not very richly compared with many books of ours and the like, but compared with the one that we have here, which is not illuminated but so heavily used. What would be more common between those two styles of medical manuscripts? A question for both of you. Maybe each of you can weigh in.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that probably my scruffy little manuscript was certainly more common. This was a workhorse manuscript that went through the hands of numerous students in the 13th and 14th centuries who were probably taking it to their lectures and studying it and annotating it. I think that the manuscript that Dot has was probably kept in the library of the Paris Dominicans at Saint-Jacques and was for their consultation, but was probably not passed from hand to hand. So I think that our manuscript in a sense is more commonplace, but maybe less commonly preserved, simply because manuscripts of this kind tended to be used to death. Manuscripts that belonged to orders like the Dominicans and that were kept in libraries, institutional libraries, tend to survive precisely because they're kept in institutional libraries. My suspicion is that before this book fetched up in Admont, possibly given to the monastery by a brother who was entering the monastery and who made over his books to the monastery, as was common at this time, that this kind of manuscript would have vanished from overuse. So Dot, what do you think?
I was going to say that I defer to you, but I agree with everything that you said. I think that the type of manuscript that you have, and which we have other ones in our collection too that are more like that, are much more common and were probably more common at the time.
Yeah.
But that this one survives probably because it was in a library.
Yeah, ours is not pretty to look at, but boy, is it full of information. I was just thinking
great.
here that the in between the lines annotations in this sort of what I would call the PowerPoint screen here, you can see the questions coming up. Okay, the text says that blood is the serum. It's a serum. It's a subtle liquid. Well, what's a serum, right? So the annotation above says, well, it's something that's sort of filtered out, right? The blood is where is the blood made? Well, good question. So he says in epita, in the liver here. So you can hear the teacher expounding word for word. You can hear the students' questions popping up as well too. And incidentally, Dot, your book had Isaac Judaeus, Universal and Particular Diets. Isaac also wrote a treatise on urine. And the urine treatise in your text is probably Theophilus. And our student here has noted on the side that this definition of urine is pretty much what Isaac and Theophilus say. And for good measure, he actually writes out Isaac and Theophilus' definitions of urine at the bottom. So you're seeing, as it were, the interplay of texts in this highly textualized medical culture.
We have a number of thanks in the chat to both Faith and Dot for sharing these manuscripts and your knowledge about both of them and for giving us an experience of interacting with both of them. I will answer one on everyone's behalf. We do have a recording and we will make it available. We'll send out a link by email to that once it's ready. So on the housekeeping note, we have come to end of time. Dot, did you have any final comments you wanted to share?
Just another thank you to you two. It's really fun. I do this every week. So if folks want to check in and do this again, and I'm always happy to talk about doing this sort of special event because it's fun to to see other manuscripts and learn a little bit and talk to different people. So.
Well, thanks again to both of you. I'm coming over to talking to the microphone. Right now, what everyone is seeing on my screen anyway is the both manuscripts next to each other. So I'll leave that on screen as we say good afternoon and a good rest of your day to everyone.
Goodbye, one and all.
Thank you.